Hi, I'm George Norrie, and welcome to our Coast to Coast AM YouTube channel. Have fun, tell your friends, and share us with everyone. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Coast to Coast AM's mobile app. And always remember to log on to our website at coasttocoastam.com for daily articles, the best paranormal information, and all you need to know about your favorite guests. And now you can become a Coast Insider directly through the Coast mobile app. We welcome our international listeners and even offer a free 2-week trial. So don't delay. Become an insider today. Atlantis. Has it been found and discovered? David Edwards joins us. His latest work is called Atlantis Solved, the Final Definitive Proof. We shall find out. David Edwards served as a special agent in the U.S. Army in the 1980s and 90s and is a veteran of multiple overseas combat tours. Thank you, David. He is a graduate of the United States Army Intelligence School, where he studied advanced human intelligence and battlefield counterintelligence, also completing training in Jungle Operations Training Center in Panama, Central America. David, welcome, and thank you for serving, David.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a thrill to be here. Look, I've been wanting to say this, long-time listener, first-time guest.
Perfect. Well, let's make you a long-time guest.
Deal.
How did you get interested in Atlantis?
Well, I've always been interested in Atlantis, and I'm a geek, I'm a nerd. So growing up, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and just like everyone else, I read the books. I read, Eric Von Daniken, Fingerprints of the Gods, and I watched all the TV shows. And then Atlantis kind of faded away. And about a year ago, I had listened to all the Coast to Coast AMs that I could. I, of course, had my subscription, and I listened to the past shows. But I was kind of out of content, so I was flipping around on YouTube. And there's a channel called Bright Insight with this guy, Jimmy Corsetti. And in 2018, he claimed that this place in West Africa called the Rishat structure, he thought it looked a lot like Atlantis. And I was intrigued by it, so I decided to independently verify it, which kind of resulted in the book.
Is it a landmass in West Africa, or is it an island? What might it be?
Well, so it looks like it's a volcanic dome, but it looks like Atlantis. So when you look at it, and it's in a country called Mauritania, and it looks like it has the center island, and then it has the alternating rings of land and water. And at the time period that we're talking about with Atlantis, which we can get into, it would have been a very wet environment, and it matches. If you read Plato literally as a primary source, it matches a lot. It matches specifically just about everything he said. Now we have some challenges with Atlantis because we've all heard everything, which is a challenge for us. Atlantis has kind of been beaten to death. So it's hard sometimes to kind of push all what I call the secondary sources aside. The secondary sources would be people like you and me who are smart and who have read Plato and have an opinion about it. But Plato is our primary source for Atlantis. So we had to go back and start there, and that's where the book starts.
And why so many people thought Plato was out there in the Atlantic Ocean? Because of the name Atlantis?
No, so there's a line where he says that it was directly outside the Pillars of Heracles, which we know as the Strait of Gibraltar. And we live in a Google Maps world where I think people think they hear that word, directly, and they want that to mean straight west. So they try and come up with reasons why maybe there was a large continent that disappeared in the middle of the Atlantic. What I wanted to do with this is I wanted to come up with kind of a grand unifying theory of Atlantis that embraces all of the other places that people have found that have interesting things, because I think there's a narrative there that fits. But I also wanted an answer to it that didn't contradict. So many times when we talk about Atlantis in this space, we say things like, well, the mainstream academics have it wrong, or we have to change this and this about history. And I think that this location in Mauritania solves for all of that and provides an answer that not only matches Plato, like over 99%, which I detail in the book, but also unifies all those other places that we think it is. And I think there's traces of those places in the dialogues that we can talk about.
Are there any remnants, David, of high technology out there?
Well, so George, we got to walk through this a little bit. The idea of high technology, let's talk about what that means really as we start to build the case for Atlantis actually is and what it actually was.
Okay.
So we're talking about 9600 BCE, and we can talk about how we get to that date. But that date's really interesting for a lot of reasons. It's in the middle of what we call the pre-pottery Neolithic, which Neolithic just means new Stone Age, and you had the Mesolithic and the Paleolithic, which is the middle and old Stone Age. I don't come up with these names; someone else did. But this time period is in the middle of what they call the Neolithic Revolution. And what's revolutionary about it is in about 10,000 BCE, so about 400 years before we think when Plato tells us Atlantis was destroyed, we see the beginnings of the transformation of hunter-gatherers from dragging each other around by their hair and eating dino bones to agriculture. And so we start to see agriculture all around the Mediterranean. Here, we see that also. And agriculture is the ability to grow things, but also the ability to control water flow. So when we're talking about advanced, I think we're talking about advanced from a 9600 BCE standpoint. What Plato tells us is the Atlanteans were good at two things. They were good at agriculture, and they were good at organizing themselves, which he really liked. That's one of the things Plato did, was try and figure out if the society he lived in had the best form of government, or if there were better forms. And he spent a lot of time on that. He didn't spend a lot of time on Atlantis, but whenever he found an example he thought he liked, whether it was a metaphor or whether it was something he thought was real, he would use that and then compare and contrast it to what he knew of the world that he lived in. So when we say advanced, we're talking about advanced for a Stone Age culture, and we're talking about the invention and innovation around agriculture.
So it's not that they had spaceships and computers.
I tell people when I talk about this, I say I'm like the Grinch that stole Christmas. We all stare at that Christmas present, right? When we were kids, and the weeks leading up to it, it could be anything. And then Christmas comes, and we open it, and it's tube socks. Oh, okay. Well, we need tube socks. We got to.
Yeah, or a sweater or something like that.
Or a sweater. Yeah, I live in Florida, but I don't think of sweaters. But yeah, sweaters. You Northerners would wear a sweater. But yeah, but it's something very practical and something that makes sense. And that's what we're looking at. Now, that doesn't mean that they weren't good at things that have been lost, because obviously a lot of information has been lost. But my job was to take an engineering approach and do this in a very visible, scientific way that other people can look at, and kind of just stick to the physical facts and the things we know about history. So I don't really get into whether there were death ray crystals or nuclear submarines. Plato doesn't mention those. But I don't know anything about that. All I know is, given the history we have, and I decided to treat Plato as history, which is the same way that Henrik Schliemann found Troy, by the way. He treated the Iliad as history. When you do that and you look at the geography with a realistic eye, and also with the premise that we have to be able to see it and understand it. It can't be that, I have to tell you why this is Atlantis. Anyone should be able to look at it. They should be able to look at the confirmations that I've done. They should be able to look at the other documents, and they should be able to reach their own conclusion, whether it supports my conclusion, which it will, I think, or not. But we have to do this for real. And that's when I took this on. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to get past this 1-hour documentary where the first half hour is, we see pretty people going on a travel log of nice places talking about Atlantis. And the second half is them speculating on, we have to change this, or Plato got this wrong, maybe it's 900 years. And it kind of ends with kind of open speculation. It could be one of these three places, and if anyone will give us more money, we'll go look harder. And so that's not what my book is at all. My book, that's why I call it definitive. And when you go through it all, when you decompose Plato down to literally what he's saying, and you make the rule that you can't dismiss any of it, and we can't assume he was an idiot, and he didn't get something wrong, and then you literally apply it, you start to build this overwhelming circumstantial case that we found it. And I believe that's been done. I believe that's what the book does.
We're talking with David Edward. His book is called Atlantis Solved. How did you come up with, or how did the number 9500 BC come up?
Well, so 9600 BCE, and this is I'm not the first to do this math, but basically we look at Solon, who was around 600 BCE, and he was a Greek politician. This was before the Greek classical period, and arguably Solon could be the person that kind of thought democracy might be something that was interesting to try. So as he was figuring out what it meant to be a politician and all that, he went to Egypt, because Egypt is a storied civilization. It's a good place to go to see how they do things. And they went over lots of stuff. One of the things that they went over was their ancient history, which is where he got the story of Atlantis from. And it's actually something I wanted to dispel. When we talk about that, and then the Egyptian priest told him that this happened 9,000 years before they're telling him. So you take 600 BCE, you add 9,000 years to it, you get 9,600 BCE, and that's kind of a magical date. There's lots of things we can go over that align to that date.
Now, what happened to Atlantis, David? We've heard all kinds of stories. What did your investigation show?
We have tools today that we didn't even have 10 years ago. Any of us now can be satellite archaeologists, and we can go on Google Earth, and we can see images with either 30-meter or 10-meter resolution, which is really good resolution. When you look at the JPL pictures, especially when they are to the east of where this Rishat structure is in Mauritania, you can see the runoff of water, massive runoff of water from this location to the sea. Also, Mauritania exports hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of salt every year. And when you get deeper into Central Africa, Mali, some of those other places, Chad, there's salt everywhere. Well, all salt is sodium chloride, and all sodium chloride comes from the sea. So we know that those places were underwater. When you add all that together, you look at the visual evidence, it looks like a tsunami. Now, the source of the tsunami, I don't know. I know lots of things were going on at this time period that we can talk about. It's been speculated maybe it was a comet impact. Maybe it was an earthquake because we're dealing with the Atlantic Ridge, which is very thin and could shift. What we do know is 9600 BCE is the end of the what they call the Lesser Dryas period, which is basically the end of the last ice age. And we have and a dryas, by the way, is a flowering plant that grows well in higher elevations and cold. So when we go dig stuff up, we can see how many dryases there were, and we get a feel for what the temperature was. And at 9600 BCE, something happens, and the temperature rises 40 or 50 degrees Fahrenheit in about a year. Now, it wasn't rising seawater, but that's shifting the weight around the Atlantic Ridge, and it'd be very natural for there to be an earthquake. So either an earthquake or a comet impact or something, but I don't know. Well, I can see the results of it very clearly, which is it was water. So water from the sea hit this thing. Now, supposedly it was an active volcano. So you dump seawater into a volcano, bad things happen.
Now, the flood of Noah was about 4500 BC, right?
Arguably.
So I would not think it had anything to do with this, or what do you think?
No, we're back. I think 9600 BCE is pretty well
established.
It's pretty well established. And you get into later floods, and you get into all of those things. Plato doesn't talk about those. So I am literally taking Plato as history and working my way out from that. I don't try and compare some of the mythology, although we can certainly talk about some of the mythology. And I don't really try and marry it up to things that happened later, because Atlantis at that point was gone. So when it comes from an Atlantis standpoint, it's at 9600 date.
What do you think, David, happened to the people who occupied that region?
Well, Plato tells us they all died. Now, with that, this is a localized event, and what it looks like the people of Atlantis, Plato tells us that they had conquered Libya up to Egypt, and they had conquered parts of Europe around the Mediterranean to the north. So we know that we have Atlanteans in Libya, in Egypt, and in Europe, which aligns to some of those other places that we can talk about that people like. People like Spain, they like Santorini, they like stuff like that. But when I did this, I said I have to find corroboration. So to answer your question, I found two corroborating sources, primary sources. And the primary source is, the original, the origin of the information, not people reading it and talking about it. And there's this fellow named Herodotus. And he wrote before Plato, about 100 years before Plato, and he died right about the time Plato was born. And Herodotus was really the first person in Western society that tried to write down history. And he wrote this thing called the Histories. And the first third of the book is he just kind of did a brain dump like a travelogue of everything that the Greeks knew about the world and what everything was called and who everybody was. And then the second 2/3 is he write down what was going on, the war with the Persians, all that stuff. In that first third, he says, if you go to Egypt and then you go west for 10 days, you run into these people that call themselves the Atlanteans. Then if you go 10 days more, you run into more people that call themselves the Atlanteans. And that pattern follows all the way to the Atlas Mountains. And that name Atlas is important because, and those are in Morocco, and Atlas was the king of Atlantis. So we have the name of those mountains, but then Herodotus tells us these people are weird. And he doesn't talk about them a lot. He talks about them in two different paragraphs right on top of each other. He says that they lived on top of salt piles, that they would tell you their name, but they wouldn't let you write it down. They refused to record their history. They didn't dream, whatever that means.
Strange.
And they were vegetarians, and they spent their days cursing at the sun. Okay, but so we have a historical primary source that tells us where the Atlanteans ended up. They ended up north, up on the Mediterranean coast of Libya, which is exactly where you would end up if the city was where this Rishat structure was, and it was wiped out by some type of flood event.
Now, the water has obviously receded. Were there any remnants of structure or anything like that left?
So we found whales. So we have non-fossilized whale bones from the time period. So we know that the ocean made it that far. When it comes to what's physically there, it's all bedrock at this point. But there's one of the guys I work with. His name is David Hansen, and he was there last year. And I'm actually funding an expedition. He's going back next month. We found two locations. This is super interesting because we're not going to find buildings. It's not like Egypt, where they built with massive 300-ton stones.
Right, exactly. No huge pyramids or anything out there.
I think those were built because of this, because people were like, we need to build something that lasts. but Atlantis was nice. But what we're looking for is what we're going to find is the agriculture, and we have found two spots where Plato tells us that they had 60,000 10 stadia by 10 stadia farms on this giant plain. The plain was 3,000 stadia by 2,000 stadia by 3,000 by 2,000. So one question, what's a stadia, right? We got to answer that. And this was written during the lifetime of Alexander, so we're using the Alexandrian measure, which is what Plato would have been talking in, which is 607 feet. So a 10 by 10 stadia farm would be about a mile, about 6,000 by 6,000 feet, just a hair over a mile. We find massive canals in what I think is proto-terrace farming, about 10 miles to the north, which is where the northern mountain ridge is, north of the Rishat structure. And then we find it again about 20 miles to the south down what would have been the waterway. And these are big. These are tens of miles across with canals that run for dozens of miles and then head under the sand. And they're covered by something called an evaporite. And we're lucky. We're going to get lucky on this, George, because what an evaporite is I mentioned all this salt. When the water it doesn't all drain off, some of it just evaporates and it leaves the salt.
Right.
But then it went from what was a green environment, like I live in Florida, so it was like Florida. It rained a lot, it was fertile and all that, and it turned into the Sahara Desert that we know today. So that salt sits there, and if it's exposed to the sun over hundreds of years, it bakes, it cooks, and it becomes like a rock. And we found these fields, especially the ones to the north, the one that's 10 miles to the north. All these canals are covered with about a foot of evaporites. Wow! So it's going to preserve the earthwork. Now there's a lot of sand over, but there's areas that are open. I've had a geologist work with me, and that person is also a geochemist. So we're going to collect some of the samples, but they're like 80% sure. None of these guys will commit to anything until they physically see it. But it looks like salt evaporate. So we're gonna have the agriculture piece that's going to marry up to what we're told about Atlantis, and that's going to be the piece because everyone wants to see something, just like your question. Everyone wants to see a building or a flag or something that says Atlantis, and we have it. It's going to be the agriculture and the proto-terrace farming that leads us there. And I'll just mention the Atlas Mountains, about 200 miles to the north, is there's lots of ancient terrace farming. So again, if the Atlanteans were wiped out and pushed up there, you see remnants of their technology, their advancement, continue on in the Atlas Mountains.
David, what do you estimate the population of Atlantis to be prior to whatever disaster occurred out there?
Well, that's a good question. So we know, as I mentioned, there were 60,000 basically 1 mile by 1 mile farms. Each of those farms was responsible for providing 1/6 of a war chariot. So they had 10,000 war chariots, and they were responsible for providing, people to be in the army. So you're probably looking at a population in the 500,000 or 250,000 range. When you look at the entire population, now this is over, 300 by 200 square miles, which it's a big place. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people.
I suspect an asteroid may have hit the planet at that time, David. What do you think? What's your best guess?
I won't speculate on it because I can't step outside the box. I don't want to have to defend astronaut strike theory as I try and, explain how Atlantis has actually been found. However, having said that, it was something on that magnitude. I think the fact that Herodotus says that the remnants of the Atlanteans, and this is thousands of years later, but that they cursed the sun, I think that's a cultural trace.
Mm-hmm.
Something happened with the sky. Now we all know, the displacement theories, the crustal shift. A comet coming in would have looked like the sun was doing funny things. If it hit right and the Earth wobbles, it would look like the sun was doing funny things. So I think it's something like that. It could have also just been that the ice melted and there was big shifts in the land because ice is heavy and when it goes into the water, it more evenly distributes and there are massive earthquakes. But I like the comet theory, but I don't have any proof of it, and Plato doesn't mention it, so it's kind of outside of what I know.
And whatever happened, I think, happened pretty darn fast, don't you?
Well, he says it happened in a day and a night, and I think that's consistent with what we're seeing. It was some massive event, and everywhere you look, you see signs of some type of cataclysm. You see these buildings, nothing to do with Atlantis, but you look in Egypt and you look in Peru, you see these buildings with massive stones, hundreds of tons, and they're all tipped over. It looks like something knocked them over. So it would have to be something on a massive global scale. There's a lot of theories that every 12,000 years something like that happens. I think if we can establish that this one happened, I think that lends a lot more credence to actually research this stuff for real and get more people looking at it. Because if it is 12,000 years, this was 11,600 years ago, so that the clock's ticking, if you know what I mean, and we're getting close to that cycle, if that cycle is right.
If anybody survived this, David, where might they have fled to?
Well, there were clearly survivors because the story made it to Egypt. We know that there's remnants of Atlanteans in Libya and in the Atlas Mountains. So, if they really were, Atlantis is actually three different things. Plato talks about three different things. He talks about the city, which is the capital city of Atlantis, which is what we always look for, those concentric circles. Then we have the continent of Atlantis, which he gives us a lot of information for also, which we can talk about. And then you have the kingdom of Atlantis. So when you talk about, the kingdom of Atlantis, it was very well spread out. And if they really had conquered Libya and Europe and all those places didn't necessarily get wiped out by the same tsunami that hit West Africa. So I think remnants of the civilization logically survived, which is how we get the story today.
Now, if there was a continent of Atlantis, how big might that have been?
Well, we know. We know exactly how big it was. Plato tells us that it was bigger than Asia Minor and Libya combined. So when you look at that, you're basically talking about Turkey, which is what Greeks thought of when they thought of Asia. Alexander the Great didn't make it to India for another 100 years after Plato. And he tells us, when you look at those land masses, it's about 1 million square miles. So we need a land mass that's at least 1 million square miles. Now, Plato also tells us there were mountains to the north. He tells us a lot about the plains, and he tells us there were some less impressive mountains that also bordered it. When you look at West Africa, you have Chad and Mali, and you have Niger, and you have less impressive mountains that form a ring around it. And I think West Africa in ancient times is as much a continent as Asia and Europe are separate continents, because Plato didn't know about tectonic plates, but we look at Asia and Europe, separately because they're separated by great distance and by mountains. I think we have the same thing in Western Africa. And Western Africa is the only landmass anywhere, even one that has disappeared. It's the only landmass with the geographic proximity to where it needs to be that meets the size requirement, because the countries around Mauritania are actually about 2 million square miles, so about twice of Libya and Asia Minor, which of course is bigger, as Plato tells us.
How do you think Plato got the information in the first place?
I'm glad you asked me that, and I like to dispel. So there's a rumor when you try and discuss Atlantis with people. You have to deal with kind of meta arguments, and then you have to deal with detailed arguments. One of the meta arguments that often comes up is this was some kind of oral tradition that was passed down over hundreds of years. So there was really no chance that whatever Plato wrote down was accurate, because that long oral tradition was sure to drift, as they call it. So they call it drifting.
Right.
But that's not what Plato tells us. Plato goes out of his way to tell us that he provides us the chain of custody for the information. This is also often ignored for people that look for Atlantis. He tells us that this guy Solon went to Egypt and wrote it down. And then this is all in a dialogue called Critias. And Critias is Solon's great-great-great-great-great-grandson or something like that. But the scroll that Solon wrote it on, Critias has in his possession. In fact, there's a line. I often read this. It's real quick. It just says, this is Critias talking in the dialogue. He says, my great-grandfather, Dropides, had the original writing, which is still in my possession and was carefully studied by me. So we're not dealing with an oral tradition. We're dealing with something that was written down as a primary source, as I keep saying, and then Plato is recording what that primary source said. So it's a direct... It's a direct lineage, if you will, or a really solid chain of custody for where the information came from.
Edgar Cayce, the late great prophet, wrote several books about Atlantis, David. And, he's very kind of similar with some of the things you've been doing. Have you read any of his works?
I have. I read his works a while ago. I'm familiar with him. I've watched many a TV show, some of which you were on, by the way, about him.
Yeah.
And so I'm very familiar with him, and that's the Bimini Road, and Bimini Road was going to rise in 1968 or something like that, and he did visioning and stuff. I'm familiar with him. Since I'm going back to the source material and push, he would still be a secondary source. He's a guy like me or like you who's read Plato and then is adding his own voice to it, but he didn't see it. He didn't see the scroll from Solon. He didn't talk to Critias. So I don't have much of an opinion around that beyond acknowledging that I know the Bimini Road and that he has said lots of things about it, which I am familiar with.
In the history of mankind, do you think there were many Atlantis-type disasters or just this one big one?
Okay. So speculation warning, right? This isn't in the book, and this isn't part of Plato. I think we need to establish that this one happened in 11,600 BC, about 12,000 years ago. And I think there is a pattern of it. I think we can see that. You can trace back. But the problem is it's very hard for us to look backwards. We think we're much better at it than we actually are. We try radiocarbon dating. We try digging holes and hoping there's something down there. But it gets really fuzzy the farther back you go. I personally think after really digging into Atlantis and looking at a lot of these other places, that there is a recurring cycle of this, but I have no proof for it. The evidence seems to lead there, which is why I think if we can establish the Atlantis date and get that as part of canon, if you will, part of our history, then all the people and all the resources that study this stuff can start looking at it with fresh eyes and clear eyes, and maybe we can get a better answer about what kind of planet we actually live on. In your research, David, was there anything you came across that shocked or startled you? Yes, there is. The biggest thing, we've talked about Plato, we've talked about Herodotus, we're talking about Atlantis, and those are all known sources. I didn't discover any of that. My original contribution to this, which I was up for probably a week when I finally found this, is I bought, in 1995, we probably all bought Graham Hancock's book, Fingerprint of the Gods, brilliant book. It opens with the discussion of the Piri Reis map. Now, Piri Reis was an Ottoman navigator, and he had this map commissioned in 1513. The noise around the map or the interest on the map is on the left-hand side. It seems to show more about the New World than could have been known in 1513 when the map was made. Remember, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, so this is only 21 years later. That's right. And they didn't have email, so it took a long time for that to get around. And then on the bottom, it seems to show Antarctica without ice, and it seems to show the continental shelf between South America and Antarctica, which would have been visible if the water were lower, if we were part of an ice age. And it sure does seem to show it. There's arguments against it, there's arguments for it, but we've all been looking at this thing. I've been looking at it for 25 years, and then I look on the right-hand side, and there's Africa is depicted on the map. And this map was supposedly put together through older source material and ancient maps because this guy, Piri Reis, is a navigator, and he's going to take this map and he's going to get on a boat and they're going to go around the world. So he wants to be as accurate and have as much information as possible. On the African side is this kooky little city surrounded by a ring of water in Western Africa, exactly where the Rishat structure is. And it has a river leading up to it, which is blocked by a bunch of mud, which is something that Plato tells us had happened. He's drawn giant pictures of elephants on the map right in the same location. Plato tells us that elephants were abundant. He's drawn green mountains to the north of where the Rishat structure is. Plato tells us they were beautiful green mountains. And all of this is where today is nothing but the Sahara Desert and sand. It's a miserable place. So the idea that this Ottoman navigator would risk his life on a baloney map and have rivers leading into the middle of the Sahara Desert that don't exist, it's not really practical. So it was based on a map that showed what was going on there some time ago, and it seems to have captured the memory of the city of Atlantis surrounded by a ring of water where it's today is the Western Sahara.
Could that map have been taken by extraterrestrials from above?
Well, Plato doesn't mention extraterrestrials. He mentions some kooky things. The map suffers from the same things that navigating suffer from today, which is if you don't have an accurate clock, your east-west measurements are not as accurate as your north-south measurements. And this map has those same characteristics. So it seems more like this map really was put together from ancient maps of people going around and doing the best they could to record the geography of where the land and water come together. For example, on the left side of the map where you see South America, there's 3 different entrances for the Amazon River, probably because there are 3 different maps, and they all had it in a slightly different place, and all 3 of those were then translated onto the map. So it's probably more the work of just folks that went around and saw stuff.
Fascinating. It really is, David, isn't it?
Oh, it is. I want to get through all the similarities between what Plato told us around it in this particular site. And also, he mentions that Atlantis had the capital city, which was governed by King Atlas. So we have the Atlas Mountains in this place. But there are also 9 other provinces. And the provinces were ruled by 5 sets of male twins. And he gives us names of the twins, which, since I'm looking at this as a historical document, we now have a phonetic history. And I've actually worked with a linguist, and we've tried to look at the names of those twins and see if any of that linguistically translate into names that we have today. And they all don't, because there's language is a funny thing, but some of them do. And so some of them speak to places where people have found what they think is ancient civilizations, and some of them said, "Hey, this is Atlantis." It's not Atlantis like with a capital A, but it's Atlantis, the kingdom. It's one of the provinces. For example, the eldest of the 5th set of twins, his name was Azores.
Azores, there you go.
There you go. And some people like the Azore Mountains, and they say they found things there, and maybe they move above water. And I say, yeah, absolutely, because I mean, this theory unifies everything. So Santorini, or the Minoans. One of the princes was named Meneses, which is a lot like Minoans, and there's a deep bull culture and diving islands associated with that. So there are places. There's 4 or 5 places I think are pretty solid candidates, and then for places like for this one called Evermon, that was one of the princes. That sounds like Avalon. Which was a mythical island that was up around, Britain and Ireland and all that a lot of people like for Atlantis. So it's not the capital. There's nothing there that tells us it was the capital, but phonetically it's mentioned in Plato's Critias. So when you actually look at it for real, like I looked at it as an engineer, and you break it down, and then you start to do the research for real, not whimsically, but seriously, it's all right there, and it all kind of fits together.
Have you shown your work to geologists, and if so, what did they say?
Absolutely. In fact, the geologist was the one that told me about the evaporites, because I was showing them where I'm like, this looks like canals, and this looks like terrace farming. It looks like people worrying about water flow. And some of the canals, some of the lines run for a long time, and then they kind of curve around and run back the other way. And they looked at it, and it's a funny story, because when I showed it to them, I don't tell people, hey, I think this is Atlantis, because as soon as you say that,
they freak out, right?
Well, you get different answers. And I did that with this person, too. But at first, they looked at it and they're like, wow. Okay, first off, they said, well, we're looking down the ground. They're pretty sure it's the evaporites, if they can get a sample, and we are going to collect a sample in about a month. They can be sure. They think it's a salty evaporite. And then they even commented. They said, because there's lots of grid patterns. There's straight lines that run for dozens and dozens of miles. And then there's all these grid patterns that get formed off of them. And they're like, that's not – they don't know what would have caused that naturally. So then I say, well, do you think it's ancient agriculture? And they don't know. They haven't heard of anyone saying that. And I'll say, do you think it's Atlantis? And now they're checked out, of the question. But yeah, so I had a linguist help me, and I've had a geologist help me, and this person specialized in geochemistry, so they know a lot about the makeups of the rocks and stuff. And then we have people who've been on site.
David, where do people get this book, Atlantis Solved?
It's available on Amazon, or you can go to the publisher website, frequency99.com.
Super. I also have a book in my hand called Atlantis Found by You. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and I apologize. When I sent you the book, that's a compilation. It includes Atlantis Solved. And it's a compilation that when I go to trade shows and Comic-Cons and stuff, it's got some other books in the back, just history books in the back.
Right.
But yeah, no one can buy that. Only from me at trade shows where I'll sign it.
For a moment, I was getting into an argument with our producers saying, you gave me the wrong book title. I've got it in my hand. But they said, no, there's another one.
Yeah, I apologize to you and your producers. I've made it as difficult as possible. So we just, but that's behind us.
Anyways, this mystery of Atlantis, do you think, though you have solved it, you believe, do you think the world is going to believe it?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I want to make sure we talk about. I want to rattle off the evidence, of the actual measurements and stuff that match what Plato said.
Sure.
Also want to make sure we go over this. There are some criticisms of this site, which I do address in the book, but I want to address. But specifically to your question, I mentioned we have satellite archaeology today, so lots more people can see lots more things. But I think we're ready because some things have happened. We had 150 years ago, Hendrik Schliemann found Troy in this exact same way. He said, I'm going to treat the Iliad as actual history. I'm going to use this geographic clues. And sure enough, what we thought was a myth turned out to be a real city. We had Francis de Orellana. I'm going to probably say that wrong. He was the first Westerner to completely traverse the Amazon. And he said he saw massive civilizations and buildings and all kinds of stuff. But in history books, even right now today, they say that, and then they say, well, he was making it up because people went back 100 years and there was nothing there. But in just the past 4 or 5 years with LIDAR, we're discovering he was right. So the history books we have today are wrong, but it's accepted. It's not like it's challenged. We can see the buildings under the tree canopy. And then, of course, we have Göbekli Tepe, which we're all, if anyone's into this area, they're familiar with that.
Yep.
And that's also accepted by what we would call mainstream people. It's part of history, and it dates exactly to the same date. So we've had enough genre-breaking things. We have enough research and technology, like with the Amazon, as I mentioned, and we have dates that establish this. I think it's possible that we can get this accepted and get people looking at it and researching it and all the things that will happen when this becomes more of a mainstream answer.
What are some of the criticisms you mentioned of the site itself?
Yeah, so there's actually 5. There's 5 big criticisms. So, and I want to rattle off all the pros, but here are the cons that they talk about. And remember, we're talking about a structure that looks exactly like what Plato described from the city standpoint. It's got that ring structure, but it's very far inland. So one of the criticisms is that, as you've read, Atlantis was an island, or it needs to be in the middle of the Atlantic or that kind of stuff. But there's a line from Plato that kind of is always dismissed. It amazes me when I actually dug into this. All those shows, George, you and I have watched, all these people we've talked to, they've missed this line. Let me just read it real quick, but it addresses the criticism of being too far inland. This is directly from Plato Critias. He says, and he's talking about where the city is. And he says, the country immediately about and surrounding the city was a level plain, itself surrounded by mountains which descended towards the sea. It was smooth and even, and of an oblong shape, extending in the one direction 3,000 stadia. Well, that means it's 3,000 stadia from the sea, which is, we talked about what a stadia is, 607 feet in the Alexandrian measure. So that comes out to 345 miles. So how far inland do you think the Rishat structure is?
Good point.
345 miles.
Exactly.
So it matches. So the fact it's that far inland is not, it's used as a criticism, but it's actually the only location in the universe that is that close to Greece and it has that characteristic. Another critique is that it's too high. It sits around 1,100 feet above sea level. And what people want is they want salt water, to flow backwards, I guess, from the sea into this thing. But that doesn't make any sense. But its elevation, it's supposed to be on a gently sloping plane. I measured the slope in the book. It's like 0.007%, something like that, which is absolutely perfect. And if we just accept and remember how weather works, we all learned this in second grade, right? We've got water in the ocean. The sun shines on it. It evaporates. It forms clouds. The clouds move over the land. It rains. It rains into the mountains and onto the land. That forms rivers. The water then flows to the river back to the sea. And we see that exactly with this geography. And then we're also dealing with the time period where we would have been in what they call the Green Sahara. It's not disputed. Everyone accepts it, where there was ample rainfall. We had Lake Chad in the middle of Western Africa, or actually Central Africa. It was the biggest freshwater lake at the time, and the rivers all flow. They're very well documented rivers. They flow right through this place. So its elevation isn't the problem either. Another criticism is that it was naturally formed, which is not actually, Plato actually tells us it was naturally formed. He tells us that Poseidon made it, and Poseidon's the god of the sea and volcanoes and stuff. So unless we're saying that Poseidon was a guy going around digging holes, which he wasn't, then Plato's also telling us that it was naturally formed. Now, he tells us that it was worked pretty hard after it was found. The Atlantis did a lot to it, but it's still, so this volcanic dome, this Rishat structure sits on, fits that natural formation perfectly. Another criticism is that Plato says that when the Atlanteans attacked Greece, and we haven't really gotten into the war, which we can, he said they came from the sea. And since this is in Africa, that's presented as maybe a contradiction. But it's actually not, because there's a waterway to the river. We have that Piri Reis map I mentioned, and you're not going to walk. We know when the Greeks attacked Troy, the Mycenaeans attacked Troy, they didn't walk. They launched boats. They could have walked. It would have been a lot shorter walk than if the Atlanteans tried to attack Greece. And since I have the military background, I understand staging. I understand all that stuff. And having them come from the sea, basically through the Strait of Gibraltar, is kind of irrelevant. Some people say the physical geodome that looks like Atlantis is too big. And they say this because there's a passage in Plato where he's trying to explain the bridges they built around the rings, because they dug this canal, which we'll talk about. They dug this 50 stadia canal from the outer ring to an inner harbor. And then where they had to dig through those rings of land, Plato tells us that the outside ones were 3 stadia, which is like 1,800 feet, and the inner one was 2 stadia, which is 1,200 feet. But they want to use that, and he says that's the breadth. And as an engineer, I know you deal depth and breadth, and then you deal length and width. But they want to use the breadth as the length of the land, and then they shrink it in. They say it's too small. It's actually not. And when you look at the actual geology, we can find those openings. We actually can find where there's an 1,800-foot piece dug out of the outer ring, and it's to its south, exactly where the canal would have been. And the last criticism is that Plato tells us that Atlantis was on the way to the opposite continent, and they say this place isn't on the way to the opposite continent. And that's actually an interesting one, because it means that the Egyptians of 600 BCE knew about an opposite continent.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Kind of amazing. But so what I did is I said, okay, let's see. I looked at the currents of the ocean, and when you come out of the Strait of Gibraltar, directly out is Morocco, and the currents take you right down the coast of Africa. But I was like, okay, how can I test this? So I went and looked at Columbus's voyages, because Columbus is held out as, well, Columbus sailed, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and he sailed straight across. Well, he actually didn't. It's kind of amazing. You look at the path he took, and he leaves Spain and he goes to the Canary Islands, which is right down on the way to where this river would have been, and to the Richat structure. And then he takes the currents and he loops around the currents, because the closest point is the tip of Africa to the tip of South America. Now, his first journey, when he didn't know what he was doing, he did try and go straight across, and we all know that was like a 10-week nightmare, right? They had 2 weeks where there was no wind and all that, but he actually went 4 times. And other than the first one, he still went to the Canary Islands in the first one, but the other 3, they all went way down the coast of Africa and then around following the currents, which takes him exactly by where the entrance to the Richat Structure River would have been. So those are the criticisms, but they wind up being strengths when you actually kind of dig into it and do the actual research.
All right, my friend. Thanks for being on the show, David. Good luck with everything you do.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
The Coast mobile app is now available for download on iPhones and Android devices. You can become an insider directly through this app. This is a great option for our international listeners, and new users will also receive a free 2-week trial.